Welcome to part 10 of Unit 5, which is Cognition. Today what we're going to be talking about is group differences. And again, we are still focused on this idea of intelligence. So first, let's talk a little bit about gender and the similarities and differences in gender. Now, we'll actually dig into this a little bit more in some of our other units in ways that are kind of beyond intelligence, I guess. But one thing that's really important to notice is that overall, men and women are actually incredibly similar, at least as far as we know when it comes to psychology. And when we look at IQ tests or intelligence scores, we actually know that overall, men and women tend to score equally. Now, where we get our higher or lower scores, there are some differences there. But if we're just looking at kind of the raw overall number, there isn't really a difference between men and women as far as intelligence goes. Now, like I mentioned, there are some differences though. And one of them has to do with where we perform better or worse. Now, men tend to perform better on tests of what are called spatial ability and on complex math problems. So this idea of being able to visualize and see spaces and objects and things like that and our kind of complex mathematical equations, that is where men tend to outperform women. Now, women also have areas where they tend to outperform men. So we can kind of see a whole list here, right? So women tend to perform better in spelling, verbal fluency, locating objects, detecting emotions, and sensitivity to touch, taste, and color. So again, there are kind of these two separations. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting, and again, this isn't something that we know 100% yet, is that, but there is likely an evolutionary and a social component to why men score better in some places and women score better in some places, and why we actually even approach problems differently sometimes. So socially, we can think about how do we raise men and women differently, and again, we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth when we get to development. But the reality is we treat young girls differently than we treat young boys, and even down to where they're infants. You know, when they're 1 year old, we treat baby girls and baby boys differently, and these differences can oftentimes cause some of the differences we see. So one really simple example I can give you is kind of what you're seeing in the corner there. Although they're doing the same thing, but if we think about toys, and again, this is something we'll talk about with the development, but if you think about what kind of toys do young boys get versus what kind of toys do young girls get, those might be in connection with why we score better or worse in some certain things. So for example, it's probably more likely for a young boy to get like some sort of like mechanical toy or something where you're building things or putting things together, where it might be more likely for a young girl to get something like a doll or a playset. And again, each of those things has certain skills that come with it. If I'm building things all the time as a young kid, I'm going to be pretty good at putting things together and spatially understanding things as an adult. Where if as a young kid I'm like role playing and I'm playing house or playing teacher, right? Those are things that are going to build my ability to speak, build my spelling, build my fluency. So there's differences in social components that can actually might be, and again, we don't know for sure, but might be leading to these differences that we see. There could also be a evolutionary component. So if we think back, again, when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about thousands and thousands of years. If we think back to when human beings were all just tribal and hunting and gathering, in most communities, the men would have been the ones who were hunting. So they would have been leaving, the tribe or wherever they were set up and going off and finding food and having to come back. Well, if I'm hunting, that's going to be building my spatial abilities, right? My ability to track an animal, my ability to actually kill that animal with whatever I'm using, whether it's like a bow and arrow or a spear or whatever. Or even my ability that once I've done that, well, now I need to also make sure I can get back to where I started. So that may have been really building spatial abilities, where if in that same community, the women were staying home and they were more in a group setting, right? Whether they're caring for children or foraging or like cooking or putting together like clothing or shelter or whatever, they would have been doing more social activities. And again, if we're doing more social activities over thousands and thousands of years, right, we might be building these different things like verbal fluency, detecting emotions, and those kind of things. So there are some different, at least ideas to explain why we see these differences. Now we can also look at racial and ethnic similarities and differences. And I know I'm blocking the word there, but there's not really anywhere else for me to go here. So I'm just going to leave myself there. So we do actually see differences. So when we look at IQ tests, we actually see that there are differences in average intelligence when we look at different racial and ethnic groups. Now, one thing that's really important about this is that even though we do see differences here, we know that these are actually due to a correlation, not a causation. So basically, we know that even though if I say, like, for example, if I have black, white, Asian, Latin, whatever, like all these different racial and ethnic groups, right? Even if I see differences, I know that, or we can see through these different kind of pieces that we'll talk about in a second, that their higher or lower scores aren't being caused by the fact that they're a certain race or a certain ethnic group, but it's just correlating with that. And so here's some of the reasons why we know that's true. So first of all, we know that no matter what race or ethnicity you are, genetically, we are all incredibly similar. And in fact, like, genetic diversity is more widespread within certain racial groups than it is between racial groups. So what that kind of means is basically that within, especially, like, so if I look at Africa, for example, the continent of Africa is the most genetically diverse because that's where human life started. So all of the genetics are pretty much there. Now, all of these different groups that broke off of that, whether you're talking about Europeans or Asians or Native people, whether they're in America or South America, all of these different communities would have broken off. So their diversity is actually a smaller section of that. So we can kind of see that genetically we're actually very, very, very similar. In addition, we know that race is actually something that is culturally constructed. So what that means is there aren't actual biological things that tell us someone is one race or the other. And race actually has changed. So a really simple example of this is that in the kind of beginnings of the United States, for example, and even before that in Europe, people who were like Italian or, we can just use that as an example, people who were Italian were not considered white. They were considered a different race than, like, people from England and Germany and Norway. Now, today, obviously, that's not really a thing, where most people don't even really necessarily know the difference between someone who is French or Italian or English. They're all just considered one racial group of white. And really, these things are things that we have just constructed and said, okay, we've got kind of these arbitrary physical traits that we say, this makes you this makes you that, this makes you this, right? But they're all just things that we've kind of made up. They're not scientifically broken up. We also see that intelligence scores are increasing over time. So as we move forward, we're seeing all intelligence scores go up, not just one group or another group's. All those intelligence scores are going up. So what this tells us is that, again, this isn't something that's set in stone, and they're all increasing. So there's probably at least some sort of environmental impact going on. We also know that there's, throughout, if we just look at history, all different ethnic groups and racial groups have had what we call like a golden era. So it can be really tempting, especially like, especially even like as a history teacher, I can say when you look at history textbooks, there tends to be a lot of focus on white European exceptionalism, right? Kind of all these things. You spend like 90% of a world history class talking about Europe, and the other 10% will, like, maybe you talk a little bit about Africa and a little bit about Asia and then a little bit about North America, and that's kind of it. But the reality is all of those different races and ethnic groups have had golden eras. So I think we talk about Egypt a lot, but Africa as a whole was actually incredibly advanced and had really large, impressive civilizations with economies and ways of trading and all sorts of other things going on. We just don't necessarily always get talked about it. We see the same thing in Asia, right? Obviously, that's one that we see a little bit more of, but Asia was an incredibly advanced society for a very long time. The Middle East was the same thing during the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, right, where Europe wasn't really doing anything. The Middle East was actually having a scientific boom where they were inventing all sorts of incredible things. So we actually see that different groups have had kind of these eras where they dominated the world, whether it was in science or culture or trade or whatever, at different time periods. So because we see that, we know, okay, well, if it was just one group that had been, dominant for the entire history of humankind, maybe that would be a little different, but that's not the case. And the last pieces we actually see in modern day, we can see differences in these groups, but we can also see them start to change and shift. So, for example, the black-white aptitude gap decreases in college. So what this means is that when we give aptitude tests for to black and white students in high school, there's a gap between them, right? White students do perform better on aptitude tests than black students overall. But what happens is when all of those students go to college, if we re-give them those tests, basically what happens is the African Americans who are behind the black students actually start to catch up. The gap shrinks, so the difference between them gets smaller. Now, what this means is that the difference isn't actually due to intelligence or the genetic differences. What is due to is our environment. And this should probably kind of make sense if you think about what we talked about in the last video, where we talked about, okay, well, if you grow up in a poor household, right, or you go to schools that aren't as good, right, that's going to hurt your intelligence scores, your aptitude scores. But what happens is those students, once you get to college, well, all of a sudden, now you all are at the same school. Now you have the same level of, colleges are relatively, there's highs and lows, but they're relatively similar. So all of a sudden, you're getting the same level of education that other students may have been getting. And again, a lot of this is kind of has social impacts, right? Where you think about where do white Americans live as opposed to black Americans or other people of color, right? If you think about the differences between an urban school in somewhere like Milwaukee or Chicago or LA, right, versus a suburban school where we're more likely to see a lot more white Americans, we can see where all of a sudden that gap shrinks. So even though there's gaps in these different things, we know that these are gaps that have to do with the environment as opposed to doing with the groups themselves. So there's also questions of bias, right? So this is an important thing to think about, and something that actually is kind of I don't want to say it's like a hot topic or anything like that, but kind of still being debated of how this should be addressed as far as intelligence tests go and how an aptitude tests go in general. But when we look at intelligence tests, one of the things that's really weird about them is they can be both biased and unbiased at the same time. And that seems really weird, right? How can it be both? But there's basically kind of these two things. So one thing that we know is that at the end of the day, an aptitude test or an IQ test, so something like the ACT, the goal of the ACT is to tell me how likely you are to be successful in college. Like, that's the goal. Like, at the end of the day, that's what they want. Now, when they give that test, though, there are things on it that could very well be biased. So, for example, you can look kind of at the simple example here in that cartoon on the left. So it says, take that word, unscramble it, what is it? And so one student writes coat, the other student writes taco. Now, both of those are words that can easily be made out of those letters. But, obviously this is a fictional example, but for example, if they were looking for coat, well, if my cultural background is different, right, I might score wrong on that. And this is something that we see. If I come from another country and I come to the US and I take the ACT because I'm a junior when I move here, you might be really intelligent, but you might not know some of the words that they're talking about. You might not understand some of the things they're referring to, right? And this can be not just, country to country, but even place to place. So for example, like if I asked you guys, this is a problem that was actually in one of my grad school classes recently, but if I said, okay, there are, you need to tell me how many cows, you need to break up the cows by male and female, and you need to put them, you can only have 2 in each pen or whatever. And I said there's 7 bulls and 13 heifers. And I said that to you. Well, depending on your background, you might not have any idea what that means, right? Now, most of us maybe would know what a bull is, but a lot of you have probably never heard of a heifer before. That's not like a common term that you would know unless you were from a farming community, right? So that would be an example of something that would be like culturally biased, right? Where because of my cultural background, I'm going to score worse, even if I'm equally as intelligent, right? Just because I don't have some of these different things, these different backgrounds. And that's something that's really important that testing places try to take into account. Now, if that happens, that would be an example of an intelligence test or an aptitude test being biased. Now, how it could also still be unbiased though is that the reality is when we do these tests, they seem to be equally applicable to all groups. So what that means is this: if you do have a different cultural background, right? So for example, maybe you come from another country and you just don't speak English very well. It's good enough to get by, but you don't have the same level of speaking that you would in your native language. And you take an ACT test or an SAT test or something like that. The reality is you're probably going to score lower than you would if you took that test in, Spanish or whatever your native language was. And you might say, well, that's an example of bias. And in a way it is. But the reality is, if I want to know how well are you going to do in college, well, if you're going to college in the United States, chances are you need to speak English pretty well. And if you aren't able to speak English very well, then even though technically this test is biased and maybe your intelligence is higher than you're showing, the reality is when it comes down to how well you're going to do in college, it's probably going to be pretty accurate. So this is kind of one of those fine lines that these tests have to kind of straddle here is how do we make sure, or can we basically, and there's kind of an argument, I guess, where some people would say, well, yeah, it's culturally biased, but the reality is those cultural biases and those cultural backgrounds are going to influence their ability to succeed later on. And so even though it's biased against these groups, it's still a good test because it's still giving us a good idea of what's going to happen later on. So there's kind of that little bit of debate between those two sides of should they be entirely unbiased or is that bias okay because it's making our scores, more applicable. So we can kind of continue talking about that. So there is another thing that can be very important and actually is connected to when we talk about gender differences as well as ethnic and racial differences. And this is what's called the stereotype threat. So I'm just going to read the definition before we kind of talk about it. But stereotype threat is a self-confirming concern that one will be evaluated based on a negative stereotype. So basically the idea of this is this thought that when you're in a situation where, for example, you feel, especially if you're a minority, right, and you feel like there's a stereotype about your group, you might be worried about the fact that you're going to confirm or, basically be a bad example, kind of, where you're going to be evaluated poorly based on a stereotype that people have of you. And what happens is that because of this concern or this worry about that, you actually end up causing yourself to perform worse. So we can see this in a few different ways. So for example, blacks and women score higher when they are tested by someone of their own group. So for example, if that was in a college class, right, and you're female and your professor is also female, you'll score higher on a test than if you took that exact same test in the exact same class, but your professor was male. Now again, how they're grading isn't necessarily changing at all, but what's changing is this stereotype threat, this idea that you're nervous about not doing well, and that causes you to not do well. We see the same thing with blacks as well. We also see they did a study where they took female chess players and they had them play online, and what they saw was actually a sharp decrease in their performance if they thought the other player was male. So even if they weren't actually a male they were playing against, if they thought the other person was a male, they actually did worse. Now again, it might not make a difference. They might play the exact same game against the exact same person, but if they thought that they were male, they would actually perform worse. And this is a kind of a really common thing. And again, we can kind of connect this back to a whole bunch of other things. We can connect it back to where do men and women excel at, and where do they struggle? Where do we see them go as far as professions? So I know, like my fiance being in neuroscience in the science field, there are very, very few women that work in her same field. Very few. There's quite a bit in psychology, but she isn't really doing that. She's more of like the biology side. So it is interesting though, because she'll talk about this exact thing where she'll be in a meeting and she'll be the only female in the room. And so because of that, she sometimes feels like she has to perform, right? Like you have to do well to show everybody that women can do this thing too. And because you have that pressure all of a sudden, you actually perform poorly, right? And so this is kind of something that's what would be considered stereotype threat. And then this comic is a really good example of where it's looking at basically the same thing I just described, but you're in an example of engineering as opposed to sciences. So please take a few moments. This is our last section for cognition. Do a quick summary, and I'll see you guys later.